Hi, I'm Rebecca Balcarcel, and I walked with a friend from London to Canterbury in 2024 on the Pilgrim's Way. We strapped on our backpacks and used this guidebook to have maps and to know directions and get recommendations on where to sleep and eat along the way. Now, why did we do this? Well, we wanted to visit the site where Thomas Becket was stabbed and killed in 1170. Since he had defied the king to stay true to his faith, he became a saint, and miracles and healings were attributed to him. So it has been a pilgrimage destination for hundreds of years. Now, it was so popular that in the 1400s, Geoffrey Chaucer wrote a book about a group of pilgrims who meet at the Tabard Inn, which is on the map there, and they decide to travel together, which is good for safety, each one telling a tale along the way. And so the tales is the collection of their stories. Now, since I've read this book and taught some of the tales, I really wanted to follow in the footsteps of both those fictional pilgrims from Chaucer's book and the historical pilgrims that inspired his book. So, come with me. Let me show you how it went. So here you see Suffolk Cathedral. So this is south of the River Thames in London, and traditionally, historically, it's the starting point for London pilgrims to begin the pilgrimage. And this cathedral has inside a stained glass window dedicated to Chaucer, and you can see his face there up at the top, and then the bottom part of the window, you can tell there are like white horses, and then mounted on the horses are pilgrims. And so this is commemorating the pilgrims in his book, The Canterbury Tales. Now, in the cathedral, you can also get your pilgrim's passport stamped. So what's that? Well, the guy who's giving me an ink stamp there on that piece of paper, he works in the cathedral, and what I have there is kind of like a pamphlet folded cardstock paper that is the passport that the pilgrim carries from place to place along the journey. So every time you come to a church, a pub, wherever you spend the night, they will have a stamp for you, and you collect these stamps as you go along. So I was all excited because this is where we got our very first stamp. Also, another cool thing about this cathedral is that Thomas Becket is known to have visited it just weeks before he was murdered. And Shakespeare, William Shakespeare's brother, Edmund, is buried in this building. So Shakespeare is really likely to have walked in this building as well as Thomas Becket. Welcome to the George. This is the last galleried London inn. That means it has those balconies, and it's in the same style as many, many inns that used to be all along this street. Now it's the last remaining one. But one of its neighbors was the Tabard Inn. And in the Canterbury Tales, the Tabard Inn is the starting point for the pilgrims. So this is where they meet and decide to tell the tales. And that spot today is marked with a blue plaque, which I am pointing to, and you can read it there. I was so excited at this moment to be like in the spot where Chaucer's pilgrims set out from. This is the first church we came to after walking away from the Tabard Inn, and we actually were turning onto Tabard Street, and you could see the little sign there. This church is called St. George the Martyr, and this priest was so excited to give us our next stamp. We walked in and we were like, is anybody here? Could anybody give us a stamp? And this man was so excited. He hadn't been like stationed at this church all that long, and so this was his very first time to give pilgrims a stamp. So he was super tickled and friendly, and there he is stamping our passports. Oh, and our guidebook mentioned something interesting about this church. Apparently, King Henry V stopped here on his way back from victory at the Battle of Agincourt. And that was a really famous battle in France. And apparently he stopped at the Canterbury Cathedral too, at Becket's shrine, and then, made his way toward London and eventually stopped here at this church too. So we kept on Tabard Street, and it becomes Old Kent Road, And this whole road was very important since ancient times. It was paved by the Romans and called Watling Street, and it connected the coast to London and then went on beyond that. So we were walking the famous ancient Watling Street, and eventually we come to a place called St. Thomas a Watering. Now, for a long time it was a pub, but right now you can tell that it's a Vietnamese food restaurant. But they still have a sign that has the face of Thomas Becket. And the reason they have that sign is because it marks where this St. Thomas a Watering spot was. And they called it that because there was a stream that ran across the road at this spot. So this is where you would water your cows, your horses, or your pilgrims. It's a place to get your food, to get your canteen filled up again. And Chaucer actually writes about this spot. He says, "And forth we rode a little more than pace unto the watering of St. Thomas, and there our host began his horse arrest," meaning to make his horse stop. And of course, this is a kind of modern translation of the Chaucer. But this is a really historic spot for real pilgrims as well as Chaucer's fictional pilgrims. So by now, my friend and I were getting kind of tired and hungry and looking for a place to eat. But we were so excited to find this mural, which I had read about and heard about. It was it's a mosaic, a ceramic mosaic made by Adam Kasowski in 1967. And the building it's on, it used to be like a church, and now it's a civic center. It's kind of hard to tell what it is, but they still have the mural. And it's really cool because it shows the history of Old Kent Road, or Watling Street. It shows Romans, it shows pilgrims going to Canterbury. It shows Henry V on the white horse there, returning from his victorious battle of Agincourt in France. And another section of the mural shows Charles II. So this was really exciting to see, and a nice splash of art and beauty in the middle of a pretty kind of urban part of London. So it was a really nice little moment. Finally, we made it out of the city part, like busy streets and buses and taxis and stuff. And we walked down some residential roads, and a lot of them had writers' names like Keats or Wordsworth. And this was Chaucer Road, so of course we had to take a picture of that. And then we got on these lovely little paths that went through parks and everything. They very thoughtfully have made it easy to connect parks and green spaces so that you can walk as much as possible in beautiful surroundings and away from traffic. Here you can see a typical pathway through the woods and along a creek. And every so often you come to a village, and they always have a church and a cool graveyard. And if you're lucky, you can go in, it'll be open, and you can get a stamp for your passport and, spend a reflective moment, take a look around. And often there'll be a person there who's happy to answer questions about the history of the church. Here we are in Dartford. We're going to stay at the Royal Victoria and Bull Hotel here, a place that was built way back in 1704, and on top of renovations and the foundations of other buildings, it has served as an inn since the 1300s. So pilgrims have for sure been coming here. And in fact, the church in this town has a chapel dedicated to Thomas Becket, so that would have been a location that pilgrims would have wanted to stop. And of course, we wanted to stop partly to get our stamp, which we did. Also, this is a place where Jane Austen has stayed, famous author, as well as Queen Victoria. So it was kind of cool to be in a place that had hosted so many famous people. And then the other picture shows one of the typical signs that we saw along the trail. They have a lot of public footpaths in England. There's a law that says you have to let people cross your land if it's, if they're on a journey, if they're taking a walk. They need to be able to get through your property. And so they actually have little gates and ways to climb a fence, like little steps to help you get over a fence, gates to keep livestock in, but also allow pilgrims to come in. So it's very cool as a walker to be kind of welcomed onto the path like that. England is kind of special that way. This was another place we stayed, and I took a picture of the room because I wanted you to see how these little spaces are kind of carved out from like the attic or whatnot. This was a little room with a slanted roof and everything, and it was so charming. And they have these nice duvet covers on the beds, but the bathrooms are itty bitty because these old buildings were not originally built with indoor plumbing or electricity. They've had to add all this on somehow. So they have to carve out a little corner of the room or a closet to create the bathroom. And you can see how petite this little sink is. And it's great because, it saves water. But we were kind of amazed. So we often stayed in pubs, like rooms above a pub in an inn, but this night we stayed in a priory, which is kind of like a monastery or a nunnery, and this is in Aylesford. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales includes a character called a prioress, and so she would have been in charge of a place like this. It's a little compound, it's got a church, various chapels, places to eat, and of course, like dormitory type rooms. And we stayed in one of those rooms. You can see the little beds there. The bathroom was down the hall, so you would brush your teeth and take a shower, whatever, down the hall, shared by several people. But it was a really neat experience. You would go to the hall, the Pilgrim's Hall, built in 1290, with the Becket statue over the entrance door, and have your lunch or your breakfast. And they would tell us, like, we're serving it from this time to this time. So you show up, and it's kind of a buffet sort of situation, and you take what you want. And it's a fairly simple meal, but it was very good, especially the bread. Oh my goodness. So we finally made it to within sight of Canterbury Cathedral in a place called Harbledown. And it used to be that it wasn't built up all between Harbledown and Canterbury Cathedral. But this was the last stop for Chaucer's Pilgrim. And at that spot, the cook character is too tired or drunk or something to tell a tale. He doesn't want to tell a story. So a guy called the Manciple steps forward. And he mentions that Harbledown, this place, is the village's name means bob up and down, Harbledown. And he's referring to the hill that you have to still climb to get to Canterbury. And actually, this was also the spot where Henry II, because it was his fault that Thomas Becket had been killed, he came here in 1174, and this is where he dismounted his horse and he walked the rest of the way into Canterbury. So this is a special spot. It was kind of cool that from here you can actually see the cathedral. And we thought, oh my gosh, we're close. And of course, the other picture is showing our approach to the old city of Canterbury. So we're already in Canterbury, the modern town, but the old Canterbury, that was the entrance. They had multiple of these gates, as they're called, around the city, and a wall connecting them all. So it was a walled city. And this is a remaining gate. And once you go under that, you're in the original Canterbury. Now, inside those gates, those walls, is Old Canterbury, and this is part of that area. And they have a statue of Chaucer standing there in the main street on your way to the cathedral. And the bottom area has decoration that refers to the pilgrims, and then he's holding the text of the prologue of his Canterbury Tales. And he's also wearing the pilgrim's uniform, so to speak. He's carrying a staff to help him walk. He's got the hat, this robe. That's the garb of the pilgrim. And here we are in Buttermarket Square, the old center for where people would come to buy and sell things, bring their flocks of chicken or have their shops. So such a historic center of town. And then we walk under that fancy gate to the inner courtyard, and we actually arrive finally at the cathedral. Yay! We were really excited to arrive at our destination finally. And we spent a long time at the cathedral, but then we walked around town and saw all these buildings and signs that referred to Thomas Becket or to the Canterbury Tales. And we could tell that obviously Canterbury is very proud of their heritage, both with the book and the saint. And here's my finished Pilgrim's passport, filled with the stamps that came from the inns where I stayed and the pubs where I ate and the churches that I spent some quiet time in. Thank you very much for joining me on my pilgrimage from London to Canterbury.